First, I'd like to thank you guys all for coming out this evening. It's a little bit late. People like to do other things, but I'm glad you decided to come here for whatever reason, extra credit or otherwise. Some of you might be wondering, like me, when I come to these sorts of things, why is it a symposium on affirmative action? Why not on some other topic? Fiala already kind of notified you why it was on affirmative action a little bit. It was because for the internship, he let me decide what do you basically want to study? What do you feel like you didn't get enough of in your undergraduate experience? And a lot of the race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation issues type classes I took, one of the things I felt like we didn't really discuss very thoroughly was affirmative action. So I wanted to be able to, I didn't want to leave my undergraduate experience not being able to have at least a semi-competent conversation with someone about affirmative action. And also, even as we speak, as we're here tonight, it's still a relevant issue. Within the recent year, there have been court cases about it, people claiming reverse discrimination on the part of universities and whatnot, and similar issues. And also, I'm sure many of you know this, but out of the 3 Ds for Fresno State, discovery, diversity, and distinction, maybe some of you haven't really thought about it. The second D is diversity, meaning that it's assumed that Fresno State as a university thinks that diversity is something that's really important, and one of the types of affirmative action seeks to increase diversity. Also, several offices on campus, for example, the camp office, EOP, and Class A, while they might not technically be affirmative action programs, they at least function similarly to affirmative action programs. That is, they have parallel interests, namely because most of those sorts of programs on campus serve some sort of disadvantaged or minority group, social class of people. So it's important for those because affirmative action is important in the sense of we already have things that are very similar to it on campus around us every day, whether you realize it or not, or even think about it. So, okay. This past summer, I worked with Camp and Summer Bridge for some summer tutoring programs. Both of them were 3-week experiences, one right after another, and I'll talk about those a little bit more later. Summer Bridge is a program that's under EOP, so they're under EOP and Camp. And first, I'd like to share some of the thoughts that the directors and supervisors of those places had when I talked to them about what they thought about their programs and affirmative action. The director for Camp, Ophelia Gomez, she had some interesting thoughts. She told me that she thought it's important to have a diverse representation for groups, and especially so in important committees, so that is authoritative and decision, committees with decision-making power over, for example, who gets into colleges, who gets to become chairs of departments, and so on. And it seems to me that maybe an assumption that's in the background there is having a diverse amount of people, a diverse array of people, or specifically not all white males in all these sorts of committees, reap some sort of benefits. But what I thought that was more interesting that she said, while it's important to have a diverse representation, in the end, she thinks that those who are the most qualified should be chosen. And this kind of ties into the second thing that she told me. She said that she thinks that if we are effective enough in our outreach for students, professionals, committees, and so forth, that she thinks we should find, in most cases, at least one qualified applicant from a disadvantaged background. That is, an applicant who would not be hired primarily or with a focus on their particular background and how that relates to the program, or even if it doesn't relate to the program, but also because they are the most qualified applicant. And outreach affirmative action is one of the types, so maybe some of our speakers will touch on that. William Hardaway, the supervisor and coordinator for the Learning Center and the Summer Bridge tutoring program, and I'll quote what he said to me. He said that statistically, there is still an issue with access, resources, and representation in our country. But also, statistically speaking, white males should not feel threatened by affirmative action, and underrepresented folks should not expect to benefit from it all that often. Specifically concerning EOP, he said that while EOP may not technically be an affirmative action program, EOP contributes to affirmative action in the sense that statistically many of the students it serves would likely not enjoy the opportunities that they currently do if it wasn't for the existence of EOP. Okay, so now I want to touch up a little bit on my experiences working for Camp and Summer Bridge this past summer. I also want to note that while I was working for these programs, I was doing the majority of the heavy reading on affirmative action, so books, articles, etc., all that fun stuff, on people who were virulently against affirmative action, different forms, all forms, and people who were against, or who were for, one specific form or all forms in their arguments. So I was critically reflecting on these sorts of arguments of these people, many distinguished people, some non-distinguished, that I read as I was working with these programs. And it kind of gets difficult, because when you're working and you're really engaged on a personal level with people, and then you reflect on these larger kind of abstract social ideas, it gets a little convoluted. So I hope that comes across in what I say next. So as I was working with these groups, 3 weeks and then 3 weeks for the next one, I found myself sometimes reflecting back on some of the points the authors made about why we shouldn't have affirmative action, why they thought we shouldn't. And sometimes I found myself more inclined to agree with them, because I would reflect on the students, and some days or over a course of a week, I would think about how students seemed to perceive the program, whether they really cared about it, if they seemed like they were getting anything useful out of it, if it seemed like it was going to help them in the future. And sometimes I found it hard to justify that it really seemed like anybody was getting anything out of it. Sometimes. But also, on the other hand, I found myself sometimes, and especially at the end of each program, during the last week, and mind you, these programs are only 3 weeks. One thing you got to keep in mind is EOP and CAMP as a program serve college students here for their entire undergraduate experience, so 4 years, probably more now. Most people are stuck here for 5 or 5.5 like me. And so what I'm about to say next was only over 3 weeks as opposed to 4 or 5 years. By the end of each of the 3-week programs, I noticed overall in the classrooms, I worked as a tutor, overall with the classrooms, the students, and especially particularly for each of them, at least a few students, I noticed that a sort of spark was in them that wasn't there when I first saw them. Some of the students, when I first saw them, they were apathetic about education. They didn't really know where they wanted to go. They didn't really have any aspirations of any kind of careers that would get them out of a cycle of poverty and so on. But towards the last week, there were, at least for both of them, really sometimes just a few students that I would notice that really started to kick it into gear. They started to care about their grades. They started to care about going to college. They started to care about securing a future for them that's better than the cycle of poverty that they came from, or many of them came from, to get out of these disadvantaged classes. And what interests me, or what really hit me and made me more inclined to agree with affirmative action at the time, and I won't take a conclusive stance tonight, but what inclined me towards the other way was, what if there's a trickle effect? This is something I thought about. What if there's a trickle effect for these students? So a lot of money is spent on these programs, but even if only a few of the students at the end of the programs, if it changes their lives enough to where later on down the road, they actually become more successful, they're not, in the lower class, working minimum wage with a crappy lifestyle. I'm sure plenty of you guys have heard about that, maybe in some of these guys' classes. And I wondered, well, it's only a few people, but over time, if enough programs affect just a few people at a time's lives, maybe there's a trickle effect 5 generations down the line, where their families and friends, and especially family members who are affected by that increase in well-being, happiness, and career attainment, overall salary, income, and satisfaction with their lives. If enough people are affected by that over time, then perhaps it is worth it. Perhaps we should have more of these sorts of programs. But what I want to end with is that something that I noticed in my readings too was it really comes down to at least to me, I think it really comes down to the empirical evidence, and especially the problem of how we interpret empirical evidence. So we might like to think that empirical evidence is just like math. There's just these truths and they're just glaring out at you. Like they just tell you the truth and you just say, oh yeah, here's the data, okay, so obviously this is right. A lot of times when it comes to any kind of social issues, unfortunately, that doesn't turn out to be the case. So the difficulty of interpreting the empirical data has to do with what counts as success. Like, how do we measure whether or not people affected by these sorts of programs, or even official affirmative action programs, what counts as success? What counts as increases in happiness? How many people have to have their lives affected in a good enough way for us to deem it worth it? What counts as worth it? Do we put a dollar amount on it? Do we not care about how much it costs? These sorts of concerns, I think, ultimately, when you evaluate the empirical data, are what make it difficult. And I hope after listening to our three presenters tonight, you guys will have you go home with a greater appreciation of how difficult coming to a conclusion about either side, either for or against affirmative action or related social issues, how difficult it is to come to a very well rational conclusion on them. All right, thank you.